sorry, so similarly, when we see HR in particular, because they deal with a lot of issues which are related to employment, recruitment, training and development. It could be issues which are grievances from employees. They also have to formulate something called strategies, and these strategies then become policies and procedures within the organization. So, for example, if they have an employee who is continuously absent or regularly absent from his job role without informing the manager or the department head, that they have a procedure in place to put that particular to put the particular employee through that procedure.
Okay.
And that could be a procedure in terms of time management. It could be something to do with late attendance, and these procedures and policies which HR then creates become a regular document, and these regular documents are nothing but something called strategies which HR then has in place to employ when the situation arises. Okay, and that is what we get in this learning outcome 3 today. Okay.
Outcome 3. Okay.
So I'm going to go and discuss some of the things which there are lots of frameworks. One of the key frameworks that we look at, we've heard about Maslow's theory. We've heard about certain frameworks like the Mintzberg framework, which is the 5 Ps, which are nothing but a framework which organizations employ so that they are able to divide any objective in the organization into 6 basic parts. Okay, it is a framework which was obviously created by Henry Mintzberg. This was the person who created this, and he thought of this particular framework because he wanted to define how the managerial role works within the organization, how managers should work within the organization, what kind of interpersonal role should they play. And then he talked about this particular different roles which he proposed, and that is something which is called the Mintzberg model. So he, as a result of the study, actually ended up proposing different 10 different roles which the managers can actually adopt while working within the organization, and he divided them into 3 categories. And these 3 categories were interpersonal roles, informational roles, and decisional roles. Okay. And in each of these roles, what he proposed was that the manager should employ or put the 5 Ps model to work. Okay? And this 5 Ps were basically, if a manager decides to give somebody a job, he needs to have plan, which is first P, which is plan.
Plan, okay.
Okay? And once he has got a plan in place, he needs to create a ploy. Now, ploy is essentially nothing. What is the context? Why is the plan required? What is the ploy going to, or the context going to do? So ploy is nothing but an action or a plan which is designed to turn a situation to one's advantage. So a simple example that I would give here is, if you look at a football manager, right? You watch football, or your kids watch football anytime?
Yes, always. Yeah.
Always. So when you look at football and you look at the football manager outside of the D, he keeps, kind of motivating and talking to his players because he has a plan in his mind. That means he wants the team to win. So he then looks at a ploy. Ploy is nothing but action. That means he has a plan, which is to, the plan could be that they play 5, 4, and 3. That means 5 people play backwards, 4 in the middle, and then 2 in the forward, or something like that. That is the plan. But how does he put the plan into action? The ploy putting into action is nothing but ploy. So he works out a sequence wherein how the passes will happen and how the players will actually play together. And then he sets a pattern. So the pattern is nothing but talking about the right skills that he positions with the right set of players. He identifies the pattern in which how the players play. So if some players play very well in the forward position, some players play very well in the center forward position or in the middle position, and some work as defenders, then he identifies those patterns and then he puts them into that position so that they are able to play well. And then towards the end, the manager then gives them a perspective of what you need to do if this situation arises, or what is the action to be done if this situation comes. So Mintzberg basically came up with these 5 Ps, and he said that managers within the organization when they work between different types of roles, the three different types of roles, interpersonal, informational, and decisional roles, they have to moderate these 5P process accordingly. Okay. So this is one of the good, one of the very important frameworks that we get to see is because you hear a term that a manager wears many hats. So a person with many, kind of abilities, we say you're a jack of all trade, but master of none. So that means you have lots of skills. And when you have to use these skills, you have to use them in a way wherein these skills sometimes can be interpersonal. That means he advises his assistant coach or sometimes the captain of the team, and his role with the person in that case is interpersonal. He's only giving an advice because he's probably dealing with his peer rather than his, his subordinates. In some cases, he's passing on information. So during the match, you get to see that the head coach or the manager is actually continuously giving out, some instructions to the assistant manager or the persons around him. And that is information which they are recording. Okay, he's not playing well in this position. He should have done this. That's a mistake, things like that. And in some cases, he works purely to take decisions. And when he takes those, the employment of this 5P is something that can be done.
Okay.
Now, the other thing that we look at is, let's understand why do, so that's a framework that I will send you a handout on, and this will give important for the learning outcomes. Now, let's look at broadly what are the aims, why HR forms these strategies.
Okay.
Now, one of the key roles which HR person does is they have the uncanny ability to identify the skills in a person. Normally, you will see the HR manager is a good reader of psychology. He is able to understand people quite well. He's able to create a relationship, working relationship with his fellow coordinates, or peers or subordinates and things like that. They are quite easy to approach, in short. So HR basically looks at, because they have to form these strategies, what they have to do is they have to identify right people for right places or right jobs.
Okay.
They have to look at a mix of skills. So they have to imagine that if the person is in this particular role, he can get this kind of responsibility, and that responsibility can stretch to this particular angle. An example here would be, sometimes you see a person at the reception. Now, the receptionist normally deals with visitors, handing out passes and, making sure people sign in and sign out. But sometimes you will also see the receptionist is also swamped with other functions, things like receiving the post, things like maybe helping the visitors out in terms of, basic other things like tea and coffee, offering tea and coffee and other things. So they have to look at the person in the position which has the right mix of skills so that they can stretch from one side or work on one type of the role, but also incorporate other types which might come or arise because of, different situations. They have to look at the person from a point of view of right attitudes and behavior. You can't have somebody quite bold or, extroverted as a person in the reception, because that person might end up offending visitors. So sometimes what you have to look at is you have to look at the right attitudes for people when they employ. And they also have to look at how employees can be developed in the right way. You will see that in some cases when people are taken into the organization, they normally say that, why we want to take you on is because we do feel that you have a blank slate and we can train you and build you to grow into this role. And the reason why sometimes organizations look at it this way is that they do not want to maybe sometimes take people on wherein they have a lot of experience, because of which they become, inflexible. They are not willing to change because they have done this before, they've had that experience. And that's why HR also looks at employing people wherein they have, the right set of qualities and also have the right attitude and behavior to fit into that role or, work in that role. Is that okay?
Yeah, lovely, yeah.
Now, some of the things that we need to understand why HR also looks at building these strategies is look at the previous plan and how they can make it different this year. So every year, that a lot of employees go through performance appraisals. If you start predicting that this is going to happen, I'll go through a appraisal, my manager will speak to me, he will tell me some good things, some bad things, and then I'll get a 1% pay rise. So there's not going to be much excitement about it because you're not looking forward to it. It has become a mundane activity. What tends to you will need that cases basically looks at always looking at comparing the previous plans, and they come up with new plans which keep the organization moving forward. And what they try and do in those plans is they try and address the issues which are fundamental to hampering the growth of the organization or fundamental to the path on which the organization can grow. So an example here would be an HR manager comes up with a plan that this year, we are going to expand, we are going to take on 50 more employees. But when he makes that plan, what he's looking at is the 50 new employees that they're going to take on would be taken on in an aspect wherein they will help come in and grow the business or help come in grow the department and its functions. So they have to look at matching the issues, the plans of the previous year and what have been successful to the new plans which they make so that they are able to move forward. Is that okay?
Yes. Yes.
Now, sometimes you get to see, introducing a new strategy, a new thing, as they say, change is only constant. So what happens is when HR looks at implementing a change, there is always a resistance from the employees saying that, no, this is not required, or, that cannot be done, or, sometimes you have that resistance. Yes, so HR has to be very, very particular and subtle in bringing those changes in the organization. So when they look at introducing something called restructuring, that means they're changing the structure of the organization, like moving one employee from the finance department to accounts, or moving sales and marketing, or reducing the number of employees. That is called restructuring. When they have to do this as a strategy, they have to be very careful, and there has to be a right time for it. Similarly, on a larger scale, if one company acquires the other company, then the employees become surplus. So they have to look at, redundancies. Joint ventures and mergers basically look at that. Now, these are strategies which are employed by HR in terms of restructuring, but they have to be applied at a very right time or opportune time so that it does not have a backlash from the people in the organization or employees in the organization. The other thing which HR looks at is that these changes, which are so drastic in the organization, which happen once in, say years. Say, for example, I don't know whether you recall, for example, when you look at British Airways bought Iberia Airlines or Alitalia Airlines from Italy, there was a large-scale restructuring which happened. And that led to a lot of negative news in the environment because British Airways decided to lay off some 2,000 staff. So HR has to look at timing it well, because sometimes these restructuring strategies create something called a negative news or negative PR for the organization. So they have to be careful on that aspect. Now let's in general a few things. Why is strategy required and how it can fit in the organization? Now, when HR looks at restructuring stakeholders, who are the stakeholders in the organization? You have employees, you have suppliers, you have partners, you have board members, you have managers. They're all stakeholders in the organization. So sometimes when a strategy needs to be implemented, HR manager or the department needs to take consent from different stakeholders. That are they happy with it? Are they, looking at this particular change and things like that? Now, the other thing they have to look at is why do they look at consulting is because they have to develop or muster support for that strategy. So sometimes what happens is you will see that if there is a buy-in from the chief executive officer or the highest manager person in the organization, the strategy gets accepted by everyone. So even HR has to look at consulting, and after consulting, they need to muster or develop support. Now, once they are able to get that support and the strategy has a general buy-in, they need to market those benefits. That means you will see a newsletter coming out from HR saying that we are introducing a new system or we are doing something new. And that is to give you some benefits of why this is being brought in. So they send out newsletters. There might be some training seminars which might be organized. You might have the HR person come into your department, speak to your manager or people around you to make you generally aware of why this is happening. And why this is done? Because they want to ensure commitment from all levels that everybody is going to participate. And they also look at, because of this interactions and marketing or the internal information sharing that they do, they then look at getting feedback on this particular strategy which is being employed. And then at some point in time, once this is put into action, there's a continuous monitoring process which happens, so that if there are people who do not like it or cannot cope with it, they put some additional support in it so that they are also able to go along. So it is a very, very critical part of this particular department when they look at doing HR planning, and because of the planning, they put the strategy in place. And I'll give you a comprehensive example in one or two slides when I cover this. So lots of rules that we will study, in terms of how Harvard, say for example, how HR implements these strategies. And one of the models that we will study is the Harvard framework model. And this particular model, looks at working with all the stakeholders in the organization to implement a particular strategy. And it looks at what are the benefits, what are the advantages, disadvantages, and also flags up the issues that can come up when the implementation of this strategy is being done. So sometimes you will get to see that when they implement this strategy, they have to keep in mind that this is something which is a change which they are asking the people to do in the company, but that change will take a number of months, weeks, months, and years to happen. So sometimes you will see that HR would look at developing, certain systems and processes in place which make this transition easier. And that can happen with the implementation of something called a HRM management system. It could be to do with, looking at installing something called, a SAP module, which is for HRM. That means it automates things like how do you apply for leave, how do you, apply for or get your wage slips, how do you look at appraisals, and these kind of things, from a systems perspective. Mm-hmm. So there is a lot of investment sometimes which goes in when some of these strategies are put in place, and it is, then implemented across the organization. So in this particular slide, let's look at understanding how this is put into place. Sometimes you will get to see HR will deploy a system. So if they are putting a strategy in place like automation of the generation of wage slips. So what will happen is when you come into the office, you punch your time card in, or when you come into the factory or whatever, you punch your time card, and that time card actually no time into the system. And then that system will, at the end of the month, generate your salary slip depending on how many hours you have clocked. So if they have to deploy a system like that, the strategic direction is, before this, the salaries or wages in terms of time and other things were processed manually. But if the HR is putting a system in place, the direction is they want to automate this process. So if they automate this process, bring in an HR system, this will help them plan, time, and, keep a tab on how much time or how many hours people are putting in, and that will help them in doing a bit of workforce planning. And once the system is in place, it will also help in generating a lot of reports for the HR department. And these reports, in general, can help HR to review effectively the performance of the employees. So, if everybody says we work full time, and if you're clocking in 37.5 hours, that means you're doing your job, you're coming in on time and things like that. But if you're clocking more hours, then the system will help calculate overtime, and you will be compensated or made payments for the overtime as well. But if, in the same case, if you're not working 37.5 hours and you are late or whatever it is, then the system will generate your wage slip accordingly, wherein what will happen is it will generate lesser pay for you because it is noting the time in terms of when you're coming in and when you're going out. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
These are things that we look at, when HR basically looks at implementing some of these, strategic changes, like the introduction of an HRM system in the organization. Now, the next is formulation. Formulation is forming up of the strategy. Forming what the strategy would be, and implementation. So there's a difference between formulation, that means making the strategy, and then implementing the strategy, which is being into action. So the first three stages that we look at, in according to that diagram that we was the first stage of formulation to look at creating a direction that one HR system or an automated system. Once the system requirement is confirmed, we go out and buy the system. And once the system is bought, how will it help in planning is it will keep a tab on generating reports and give access to the HR department in general to produce reports which are tailored to the managerial requirements. And the implementation stages, generating those reports, investing in development and performance. That means training and performance, training and development of the employees so that they know how to use the system. And the last is the system then will help them through the reports understand where are the gap areas wherein it needs to improve. Things like then HR needs to work with employees who are not clocking in 37.5 hours, for example, or when they say full time, but they're not able to deliver those hours. And they have to understand why they are not able to deliver those hours, reasons. And that is where the system will then help them to, essentially those edges. So there are differences between in terms of formulation and in terms of implementation. And in some cases, if you look at large organizations, you will have different processes within a strategy. So some persons within the HR department are good at formulating, coming up with the strategy. So they will be involved in a side wherein they look at shortlisting the system, understand the requirements, and then appropriately go out and buy the right system which will work within the company. And some will in that system wherein they will be working with the employees to do training and development so that they are able to use the system and then generate reports out of the system, which can then be effectively used by the managers or the senior staff to work with employees who are not putting in their best within the company, from that perspective. So they are involved on the implementation side.
Okay.
Now, what we also look at is how is the strategic direction set. So basically that model that we've discussed, which is this slide, what the next few slides will do is basically, each of 6, boxes here. So the first is direction. Now, why do you think you need direction? Sometimes in our personal life we see that because now we always end up giving, guidance, direction to our kids. Isn't it? Don't do this, or do it this way because it is not going to hurt you, or do it this way because it is going to be better. Now, the reason why you give direction is because you've got the good of the child in their heart, that they should be, able to do it the first time, they should not get hurt, there should be a pleasure in the activity that they are doing, and they should, in general, feel motivated after they do it, after they finish completing that task. Isn't it?
Yeah.
So similarly, what you see is that HR is also, before they form this strategy, they look at internal and external environment. So external would be they look at benchmarking against competition. So example is the HR department is now looking at, in this year, looking at revising salaries because we are out of recession. So a lot of companies had not increased salaries for a number of years, and what they want to do now is the HR department has been given the task to look at salary revision or pay revision for all the employees in the organization. So what they will do is they look at the external environment, which is nothing but competitors. How much of the growth is going to be offered by a competitor in the similar organization? So if you look at, say, let's stick to the example of, say, Virgin Airways and British Airways. So if British Airways is looking at revising the salaries, Virgin Airways will also be under pressure to look at revising salaries for their staff. Now, how much is to be revised? And what increase has to be given, they will kind of benchmark with competition. So they might look at some other airlines in which this similar sort of thing has been done already. And that is nothing but external environment or competition. And then what they look at is they try and marry that with their vision, mission, values, and goals. So because you're out of recession, people are generally not traveling, they're going on holidays. The new target set would mean that they are looking at increase in passenger traffic or increase in in general number of people flying the airline, and that is where the HR will then look at sitting down with the individual departments and then look at increases in those salaries. So maybe the sales, services, agents will maybe have a slightly higher increase because they have the higher responsibility to get as many bookings as possible in terms of, passenger numbers. And then there will be incremental increases, and that is where they will marry the vision and the mission or the job responsibilities depending on the departments when they look at the increase. And that is where the output also comes in, because if the flights were going empty, for example, half empty or half board, they were still flying the plane. They will also get an increase. But if the agents or the services department gets slightly higher increase, then their increase will be motivated by bonus incentives, which would mean more number of passengers will fly. So that is why sometimes you have to marry the outcomes or the bonus with regard to the increases. So in terms of setting the strategic direction, HR department looks at external environment, looks at all these internal company goals and objectives, and also the job description of the employees before they look at deciding that increase. And in this case, they have to consult all the stakeholders before the salary approval goes or increase is implemented. They have to position it to the board, saying that, okay, if we increase salary by 1.2% for all the employees across the organization, it would mean an increase in the overall wage bill of the organization by this much, and the board has to approve it. So they have to look at, the approval coming in from different stakeholders. So similarly, when you the defining of the management system, what they have to look at is before they decide this salary increase, they have to create a policy that, salary revisions will essentially happen once in 3 years. This will then considering these factors before the revision is planned. So, for example, one could be that if the market is doing quite well and if we are growing at 10% every year or something like that, then in those cases the revisions would happen. And this is what they do is they define that they are defined. It could be an ad hoc increase or something once in 2 years, once in 3 years, and they have to pick up to be revised or looked at every 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
And then what they do is, at some stage, when they look at all this, there is a key component of this planning, which is to do with how will it affect the workforce. That means, can the organization sustain the rate forward if the increase happens? What will the increased manpower do, assuming if there is a recession in the market? So some of these key activities which are related to job description, the goal of the organization, the organization's placement within the overall market, and how much market share can it attract, will actually all put into review, and you will thinking review for the workforce. They will also look at, when I say generate, so here what they are looking is they are looking at generating specific objectives which will be fulfilled if they implement this particular plan. That means if they are increasing the wage, they are taking on more people, then they have to go through the process of recruitment and selection. In some cases, they might have to train existing employees because they have a skills gap, and they might not want to fire those employees. They want to improve their performance by putting them under a bit of training. And those trainings can only be identified if they know that the person needs to work with this particular job classification or a job description, and because of which they would need this particular training to be able to work well or work efficiently. So this is nothing but looking at the required process of training and developing that strategy. And last, again, what we look at is the HR also has to invest. So if the number of employees are going to increase, if the responsibility of the HR department is going to increase, they have to look at putting this performance management, for all departments. Could be something that's been in that role for a number of years, you know the ins and outs, you might get promoted. But if you're not performing well and you've been given warnings, your performance is not improving, then it might lead to redundancy or termination. If you get a promotion, you also get an increase in your salary. If you're performing well and you have had an increase, in some cases you might also be eligible for rewards, which is nothing but bonus or incentives. And at some stage, when you are getting all this, you still are performing well, and the HR then has to put training and development for you in your case, because they want you to then grow with the organization and take a higher job or a more higher responsibility, and for which they would like to train and develop you. And once that has been done, and you have something which is to do with, the ability to perform well at all levels, then they start looking at performance management, wherein what tends to happen is your rewards and your incentives will be much higher. That means an employee get stock options from the company. You might get a very high amount of bonus coming in. So when you look at banking jobs, for example, when you look at, say, for example, high-end jobs which are in the services sector, the CEO or the top management get awarded, annualized bonuses if the overall company does good and meets the objectives. And that is where you get to look at the performance management. And then in some cases, because you're performing so well and you're able to cope with every pressure, your job description you're able to fulfill, then the HR department looks at career planning. That means they look at moving you from a manager to a general manager to a director to a vice president to a CEO. So this process is nothing but the process of planning, but is put in place as a strategy. You just cannot come up with ad hoc, things. That okay, Naima is doing very well. She has got very good knowledge about, health and social care. So we need to make her a manager. But this is just a, ad hoc decision. How do they test that you have those capabilities? Is they put you through some hoops, some tests, some review your performance, and they feel that you're consistently performing and coming out well in these options. Then that is where they start looking at, the planning bit. And this is all then documented as a strategy, as a policy, as a procedure. So if the employees are doing well, you pick up a procedure, HR procedure, say 2.1, and that procedure talks about rewards, incentives, and bonuses. And that is only picked up for an employee who is consistently performing well and is able to deliver every time and, is growing with the organization. So these are things which HR has to put in place from time to time so that they are able to, have this documented, and anybody within it go by the book and just follow it through for doing the evaluation. The last bit that we see in that process, that we discussed was that how do they assess and sustain this compound? No, if you see the HR manager role is that they are always smiling. They're always, kind of promoting the aspect of, happiness, joyfulness, and, they're always willing to help. The reason is that even after you've, achieve these goals year on year, every year they have to do the same. That means they have to again look at performance appraisals, they have to again look at rewards, they have to again look at, training and development. So in order to make sure that every year you are, motivated, you are every year kind of passionate to do the same job within the role that you've been given, they have to continuously assess and also look at sustaining your performance. So that means, an example, that every year if you perform well, you get, say, for example, a holiday abroad or, some sort of a trip. Now, if they send you to the same location every year, then it will become boring. So what they have to come up with is, every year they basically look at new locations for, traveling. Say, for example, this year they might have sent you to Greece. Next year they might send you to Portugal. So there is a bit of an excitement. There is a bit of something looking forward to, that employees say, okay, last year we had the annual employee gala dinner, in this location, but this year the location is different. So, it keeps the organization on its toes, but at the same time, their planning continues, because they have to make sure that it does not become a run-of-the-mill or mundane operation or an activity. And in order for that to be in order for that activity to be excitement, creating excitement, motivation, they have to look at doing this year on year. And the only way they can do it is if they keep adapting to the changes in the culture within the organization, and also adapting some of the planning that they do, so that they are meeting the requirements of the employees and, the types of employees within the organization. Is that okay?
Yes.
So
Yes.
the implementation of the strategy, is important as devising the strategy. And that is where we get to see the Mintzberg model in particular, and also the Harvard framework, which basically at all, what do you call, it takes care of all the stakeholders in particular, within the organization to be effective. I think last email I did send you, a Harvard model, some sort of a handout on the Harvard model, which is the framework. So we looked at, there are lots of frameworks, but at least one of the frameworks which I would suggest that you need to go through is, the Harvard model in HR, which the HR uses very, very often to create, strategies in the organization. And this is the Harvard, the stakeholders, they look at external environment, they look at, the choices, and then they assess these outcomes or choices, and then look at what are the long-term consequences or, implementing this strategy. And that is what we have kind of looked at in the offset direction.
Okay.
Is that okay? Now,
Yes. Yeah.
apart from this, what I'm going to do is just, very brief. Now, within the HR, you will have any department. If you look at, if you look at a GP surgery, you have various roles within the surgery. You have a receptionist, you have a head nurse, you have a clinical nurse, specialists, and doctors on locum as well. Similarly, within the HR department, you will get that what is happening is within the HR department, there is my department head, somebody who's managing various functions within HR. The other way around, so for example, there is somebody who's looking at, working on the operational side of HR. You have an HR specialist. Now, when you look at these particular roles, they are very different roles within the department. So management would be the person looking at just the strategy bit, deciding the HR strategy. That would be a person who is the chief HR officer.
Okay.
Frontline management would be people who are working within the HR department. For example, I'm within the HR, I'm an HR manager, but I look after performance appraisals. I'm also a manager within the HR department. I look after, payroll, for example. Also the manager in the department, but I look after grievances or, feedback. I'm also the HR manager in the department, but I'm in development. So these are fine roles within the department. In each of these roles, and the size of the organization, the business, you will have maybe 3, 4, 5, up to 20, hundreds of people in the HR department.
Okay.
The HR director is who basically will head the overall department, but his major responsibility would be to look at operations. Within the department itself, this guy would be, this particular person, have all the others reporting into him. He's kind of the functional head of that particular department, working to ensure that the department runs, efficiently. So it's like saying you have a CEO of the organization. CEO of the organization basically does nothing but reviews, looks at delegation, looks at directives, and making sure that the budgeting and all those things fall in line. So similar will be the case of the director. He is the person who will review done all the appraisals. Have you done engagement? Have you met the targets? Grievances? Is the employee feedback in place? Things like that. And then you have an HR specialist. This is a person which works with the who is a specialist in dealing with specific issues, right? Specialist issues could be, for example, if an organization comes up wherein there is an discrimination, for example, right?
Okay.
An issue of say harassment. Now you will have people who will have the ability to be able to deal with those issues, and that person will be basically a specialist. And that could be somebody who's a specialist in benefits and compensation, right? Now, when you have employees who come up within the HR and say during the review or their appraisal, then that, I should be getting paid this much, but I'm not getting paid. I'm not happy in my job, or I'm not. Then in that case, HR specialist will bring out the information which is required to deal with that particular. So he might benefits and compensation that's saying, okay, if you are a systems analyst, this is the pay across the industry. This is what is it based on experience. This is what your job responsibilities are. This is how you're performing. And because of your performance, you are getting paid this much. So he is the person who is generally aware of the specifics of the job, and he's just in that field with a number of experience. And his word carries a lot of credibility. And from that aspect, this person in some organizations, in large organizations, you will get to see is a person who has a lot of experience, and somebody who is dealing with issues on a daily basis. Okay? So if I have to look at NHS, for example, and if I have to put the roles of, with regards, so you will see they'll find, the A&E who will deal with all the ambulances and every patients coming in. Once they are stabilized, they will move it to a department wherein, depending on what injury or kind of treatment they need, they will go into that, say, pediatrics. They will go into operations. They might go into other departments, and then there will be somebody who's a clinical director who's actually working out all the operationals, the road, who's to do when distributed and things like that. And then if there are people who have had specialist, or basically which are requiring a specialist, they will be consultants, isn't it? So that is how, similarly within the HR department, you will have different roles. In the case of health and social or NHS, when you have specific, you have a person dedicated with that particular role, dealing with a particular specific problem, and accordingly that role so that the whole department works efficiently and is able to deliver services which is required.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, very clear.
So, I'm going to present here, so now what I'm going to do is to out a copy of this presentation first. I will mix the 5P model, which will help you in understanding how the HR looks at developing strategies, and then why are these strategies put in place from a perspective of their
Okay.
good stuff. Any questions on this, Naima?
No, it's very clear. I know how they work now, the HR.
That's fine. So,
Yeah.
so I think this is in general quite an interesting unit, and one of the reasons why you're studying this unit within.
Yeah, I like to work as a HR.
This particular the sector deals with in general. People. So understand how to deal with the psychology behind the somebody in the health and social care also works as an HR manager. He might not have the term of the HR manager, but they're tasked with responsibilities of managing the workforce. So in the case of NHS, you have the clinical director who basically looks after all the doctors.
Yeah.
You have a head nurse who will look after all the nurses.
All the nurses.
So similarly, you'll have this kind of we are talking HR here, but they also manage operations for people essentially within their roles.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah. That means it's I work HR, but leading the nurses, isn't it?
That is correct. So when you have responsibility of supervision, that means you are a supervisor, you manage people. You are basically some part. You wear multiple hats, but one of your hats that you are wearing is the hat of understanding, and managing resources under you, people who are directly reporting to you. And if you understand how to put strategies in place, understand how to break them up, if you come up with a plan that, okay, this time we are going to reduce the waiting hours, from say 2 to say 1.5 hours. So you come up with a plan, and the plan has to be employed. But when you employ that plan, you have to get that buy-in from your staff. And that is where you're using the Mintzberg model, or you're using the HR strategies to kind of work within the in your department or in your immediate able to work around. Okay. Good stuff. So let me email this to you and I'll end the session here. I will email the